Well, hello there. Come on in. I'm glad you're here because I have a story to tell you about this place.
They laughed when Evelyn Hart said the dying boat at Blackstone Landing would matter again. 3 weeks later, when the river rose in the dark, that same broken boat would become the only thing standing between the town and disaster. This story is about resilience, practical wisdom, and the quiet kind of courage that people often overlook until it is the only thing left they can depend on. By the time the sun came up over Blackstone, the mud at the landing already smelled like rain. Not fresh rain, not the kind children run through in summer. This was river rain, heavy, brown, restless, the kind that seemed to wake something old in the water. A cluster of townspeople stood along the cracked wooden rail near the dock, coffee cups in hand, watching Evelyn Hart climb down the embankment in worn work boots and a faded canvas jacket that had once belonged to her father. Below them, tied crooked against a leaning post, sat the Mercy, or what was left of her. The tugboat looked half dead. Its paint had peeled away in long, sunburned strips. Rust spread along the hull like dried blood. One side sagged lower than the other, and the wheelhouse windows were so clouded with grime they barely reflected the morning light. Anyone with sense would have called it junk. Most people in Blackstone already had. But Evelyn stood beside it like she was greeting an old friend no one else deserved to understand. "Lord, she's really gonna waste her life on that thing," one man muttered. A woman beside him gave a dry little laugh, just like her daddy did. Evelyn heard them, she always heard them, but she didn't look up. She pressed one hand against the cold steel of the hull, then crouched to inspect the rotten dock line. Her jaw set, her blonde hair twisted into a rough knot that had mostly come loose in the river wind. At 27, Evelyn was already the kind of woman this town didn't know what to do with. Too quiet to charm people, too capable to pity, too stubborn to control. Her father, Ben Hart, had spent most of his life down by this river fixing engines, welding broken frames, hauling stranded fishermen, and warning anybody who would listen that Blackstone relied too heavily on a levee that had not been properly reinforced in years. Nobody listened much to him either. Then he died in late winter from a stroke that hit hard and fast while he was patching a fuel line in the yard behind the shop. The funeral had been polite, the sympathy had been brief, and the whispers had returned before the casseroles were gone. Poor Evelyn. She ought to sell the place. She ought to move on. She ought to stop clinging to that old boat like grief was something you could rebuild with a wrench. But grief was not the only thing holding her there. Evelyn knew this river. She knew the way driftwood started gathering under the North Bridge when the current changed. She knew how the frogs went quiet before a real storm. She knew the air felt different when the water table rose under the soil, and lately every sign she trusted was pointing in one direction: trouble. She stepped onto the deck of the Mercy, careful not to put her weight on the warped edge near the stern. The boards creaked under her boots. The cabin still smelled like motor oil, mildew, and old coffee grounds. It smelled like childhood. It smelled like her father calling out torque numbers while country radio hummed in the background. It smelled like every Saturday she had ever mattered to someone. For a brief second, her chest tightened. Not enough to stop her, just enough to remind her this was personal. Above her, on the bank, Sheriff Tomas Reed folded his arms across his rain jacket and called down, "Evelyn, folks are starting to talk. Again." She glanced up. They never stopped. A few people smirked. Reed sighed and stepped closer to the edge. "I'm serious. You're out here telling people to stock canned food, tie down propane tanks, move family photos to higher shelves. Mrs. Holloway says you told her to keep dry blankets in sealed tubs." "I did." "You're stirring people up." Evelyn straightened slowly. "No, Sheriff, I'm trying to wake them up." The wind shifted then, stronger than before, carrying the low, damp breath of the river across the landing. For the first time that morning, several people looked past Evelyn and out toward the water. It was moving faster than it should have been. And deep down, though none of them wanted to say it yet, the river no longer looked patient. By the next morning, the river had crept up another 4 inches. Most people in Blackstone did not notice. Or maybe they noticed and chose not to name what they felt. That was how small towns often handle fear. They joked around it, worked around it, prayed around it. But they rarely faced it head-on until it was standing in the middle of Main Street. Evelyn Hart stood knee-deep in the open belly of the Mercy, pulling a rotted panel loose from the floor with both hands. her shoulders tight with effort. The wood gave suddenly. She stumbled back, caught herself against the engine housing, and let out a long breath through her nose. The inside of the tug looked worse in daylight than it had the week before. Moisture had gotten into everything. The lower storage compartment stank of mildew and old fuel. A line of corrosion had eaten halfway through a pipe near the bilge pump. The wiring behind the instrument panel looked like a nest of brittle snakes. She wiped sweat from her temple with the back of her wrist and stared at the damage without blinking. Most folks would have seen a dead machine. Evelyn saw a list, a hard list, an expensive list, a nearly impossible list. But still a list. And lists could be worked through. From the dock above, someone called, "You fixing that boat or burying yourself in it?" A couple of men laughed. Evelyn didn't bother answering. She had learned something after her father died. People who had never built anything always had the strongest opinions about what could not be repaired. Around noon, footsteps tapped down the dock, quicker and lighter than the others. Maddie Quinn, 16 years old, sharp-eyed, skinny as a fence rail, with a ponytail that never stayed tight longer than 10 minutes. She carried a brown paper sack in one hand and a mason jar of lemonade in the other. "I brought lunch," she said, crouching near the edge of the deck. "Mrs. Holloway made cornbread, and I stole 2 slices before she could change her mind." Evelyn looked up from the engine compartment. "You stole from Bernice Holloway and lived?" "Barely." That earned the smallest smile. Maddie climbed aboard with careful feet and handed over the sack. For a minute, neither of them spoke. The breeze pushed warm river air through the broken wheelhouse windows. Somewhere up the bank, a screen door slapped shut. A dog barked once and then gave up. It felt like an ordinary day. That was the dangerous part. Maddie glanced toward the water. "You really think it's coming that bad?" Evelyn unscrewed the lemonade jar and took a sip before answering. "I think the river's been warning us for days. That levee's held before." "Yeah," Evelyn said quietly. "Old things hold, right up until they don't." Maddie looked down at the deck boards under her sneakers. "My mom says people are tired of hearing about storms." Evelyn nodded. "I know. She says folks around here already got enough to worry about." "They do," Maddie frowned. "Then why keep saying it?" Evelyn set the jar aside and leaned back against the cabin door. Because nobody had asked her that question in a real way before. Most people only wanted to argue. Maddie wanted to understand. "Because being tired doesn't stop water," Evelyn said. "Because hoping is good, but hoping without preparing is just another way of losing. And because if I stay quiet, knowing what I know, then I'm part of the problem." Maddie absorbed that without speaking. She was young, but not shallow. That was one of the things Evelyn liked about her. A little later that afternoon, Caleb Dunn arrived in his pickup with a load of salvage parts rattling in the truck bed. Used hose clamps, a cracked toolbox, 2 marine batteries that might still have some life left in them, and an old pump assembly wrapped in oily canvas. He stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, hat pulled low, with the tired face of a man who had learned how to keep going without making a show of it. "I found what I could." "At that," he said. Evelyn climbed off the deck. "You said you weren't getting involved." "I said you were probably wasting your time." She raised an eyebrow. Caleb shrugged. "I can think that, and still bring parts." That almost made her laugh. Almost. They unloaded in silence for a while. He didn't ask if she needed help. He just handed her tools when she reached for them. Like he understood pride had to be met carefully. After a few minutes, he said, "Town council's meeting tonight." "I know. They're talking about your warning." Evelyn kept tightening a rusted bracket. And most of them think you're scaring people for no reason." The wrench paused in her hand. She did not look surprised, just tired. Caleb rested one boot on the dock rail and watched the river move under the pilings. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think you're crazy." "That's so?" "No." He looked out at the current again. "I think you're seeing something the rest of us don't want to." That landed deeper than he probably meant it to, because that had been Evelyn's whole life in Blackstone. Seeing what others ignored, feeling what others dismissed, carrying things too early, and then carrying them alone. By evening, the clouds had thickened low and gray over the river. Evelyn washed her hands in a bucket, changed her shirt, and headed to the meeting hall with grease still trapped in the lines of her knuckles. She already knew how it would go. The folded arms, the polite smiles, the careful, patronizing voices. Still, she went, because sometimes doing the right thing meant walking into a room full of people who had already decided not to believe you. And speaking anyway. And as thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the tree line, Blackstone gathered under one roof to listen, not because they trusted her, but because somewhere beneath the laughter, beneath the doubt, beneath the tired old pride of a town that hated being warned, fear had finally started to whisper back. The water was colder than Evelyn expected. Not winter cold, but hard enough to bite through soaked denim and settle deep into the bones. The Mercy pushed forward with a violent shudder, her engine growling low, her battered hull knocking aside branches, porch chairs, and pieces of fence that came spinning through the black water. Every few yards, something struck the side. A trash barrel, a wooden crate, part of a mailbox post. Each hit sounded too loud, too final, but the old tug kept moving. Evelyn stood at the wheel with both hands locked tight, shoulders squared, eyes narrowed against the rain. Water dripped off the brim of her slicker and ran down her jaw, but she did not wipe it away. She only kept looking ahead. Caleb held the spotlight near the bow, sweeping it across rooftops, windows, and the twisted shape of street signs barely visible above the flood. "There!" he yelled. "Second floor! 2 people!" Evelyn turned the wheel hard. The Mercy slid sideways for one sickening second before catching current again. She brought the boat in close to a narrow white house where an elderly couple stood trapped on a sagging upstairs porch. The woman clutched a quilt around her shoulders. The man had one arm wrapped around a porch post like he was holding onto the last solid thing left in the world. Caleb tossed the rope. "Loop it under your arms," he shouted. The old man fumbled once, twice, then caught hold. It took both of them to pull the couple aboard. The woman was trembling so badly she could barely step over the gunwale. "It's all right," Evelyn said, softer now. "You're all right. Sit down low and hold the rail." They moved on. One house, then another, then a duplex near Willow Street where a young mother was stranded with 2 little boys and a beagle pressed to her chest. By the third rescue, the boat was carrying too many people for comfort and not enough for conscience. That was the cruel math of disaster. There was always someone else. Always another porch light flickering over dark water. Always another voice calling through the rain. When they reached the assisted living house near the bend, Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. Water was already pouring through the first floor lobby doors. 2 nurses stood at an upstairs window waving flashlights in frantic circles. "Oh no," Caleb breathed. Evelyn angled the boat in carefully, fighting the push of current as it funneled around the brick corner of the building. "We don't have time for careful," Caleb said. "We don't have time for reckless either." Her voice was calm, but inside her mind was moving fast. Distance, weight, drift, the angle of the current against the foundation. How long the engine could idle before choking on water spray. She tied off against an iron window grate while Caleb climbed up first. The next 10 minutes passed in pieces. A wheelchair lifted awkwardly through a window. A frightened man in an undershirt asking where his wife was. One nurse crying while insisting everybody else go first. Evelyn steadied hands, pulled weight, counted heads, and kept her breathing even. That was the thing people rarely understood about courage. It did not always look loud. Sometimes it looked like staying useful when panic would have been easier. By the time they shoved away from the building, the deck of the Mercy was crowded with wet blankets, shaking hands, and frightened faces trying not to break apart. Caleb looked back over his shoulder. "We need to unload," Evelyn nodded. Community hall. They made it there just before dawn. The hall sat on slightly higher ground, and somehow, by luck or grace, the water had not yet reached the steps. Mrs. Bernice Holloway was already outside in rubber boots and a man's oversized raincoat, waving them in like a battlefield commander. "Move, move, move," she barked. "Blankets on the left, coffee in the back, dry socks if you can find them." Maddie Quinn appeared in the doorway with her sleeves rolled up and her hair plastered to her cheeks. The second she saw Evelyn, relief flashed across her face. "You came back." Evelyn helped the old woman in the quilt onto the steps. "Not done yet." Maddie looked at the full boat, then out toward the flooded streets. Her expression changed. Not fear exactly, understanding. She finally saw the size of it. Caleb was halfway through helping unload when a sharp crack split the air behind them. Both he and Evelyn turned. The stern of the Mercy slammed hard against the edge of the curb, hidden under floodwater. The impact sent a jolt through the hull, followed by a low, ugly groan from deep inside the frame. Evelyn's face went still. She knew that sound. Caleb saw it too. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." She stepped back aboard, crouched, and pressed her hand near the rear seam. When she pulled it away, it was wet with more than rain. River water was forcing its way through a fresh split in the hull. For just a second, nobody spoke. The rain kept falling. The hall doors kept swinging open and shut. Somewhere inside, a child started crying from sheer exhaustion. Caleb looked at her. Evelyn. She rose slowly to her feet and stared out over what was left of Blackstone. The school roof, the church steps, the half-submerged feed store, the far end of town where people were still trapped. Then she looked back at the wounded boat her father had left her. The boat people had mocked, the boat that had already carried half the town through the night. Her jaw tightened. "We patch what we can," she said. Caleb stared at her like he already knew the answer, but needed to hear it anyway. And then, Evelyn's eyes went back to the water. Then, she took a breath. "We go back out." They patched the Mercy with whatever they had left. A sheet of tin, a strip of rubber, 2 bent brackets, a prayer nobody said out loud. It was not pretty. It was not strong, but sometimes in the worst hour of a person's life, ugly and temporary is still enough to save them. By first light, the rain had softened to a cold drizzle, but Blackstone was already changed. Front porches sagged under muddy water. Storefront windows were shattered. Tree limbs lay twisted across the road like broken bones. The church bell tower stood above it all, silent and gray, watching a town it barely recognized. Evelyn climbed back into the wheelhouse with wet sleeves, sore hands, and a body that felt older than it had the day before. Caleb stepped aboard beside her, his shoulder wrapped tight with a strip of cloth Mrs. Holloway had tied herself. "You sure this old girl's got one more run in her?" he asked. Evelyn rested her hand on the wheel. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm sure there are still people out there." That was enough. They pushed back into the flood. The last trip was the hardest. Not because the water was rougher, not because the boat was weaker, but because by then exhaustion had settled into everything. Into their arms, into their backs, into the way people cried quieter now, as if fear had burned itself down to something smaller and deeper. They found a family of 5 stranded on top of the old elementary school awning. A retired bus driver clinging to a satellite dish. A boy no older than 10 sitting on a garage roof with his dog tucked inside his coat. Each stop took longer than it should have. Each turn of the wheel sounded like it might be the last. And then, near the far end of town, they heard banging from the 2nd floor of the feed store. Evelyn turned the Mercy toward it fast. Water had already swallowed the front steps. Feed sacks floated inside like swollen ghosts. Sheriff Reed was at the upstairs window with 2 men and a woman holding a little girl in pink rain boots. For one brief second, Reed looked almost ashamed to meet Evelyn's eyes. Then he said the only thing that mattered. "Thank God you came back." There was no room left on the boat for pride. No space for old arguments. Only people, only need, only time slipping away. They brought them aboard one by one. The little girl was last. She wrapped both arms around Evelyn's neck and would not let go until Caleb gently lifted her down beside her mother. By the time they made it back to the community hall, the Mercy was taking on water faster than before. Evelyn tied off at the rail, helped the passengers ashore, waited until the deck was empty. Then she turned back. For a long second, she just stood there looking at the boat, at the rust, at the dented railing, at the wheelhouse window her father had once patched with his own rough hands. The Mercy had never been beautiful, but she had been faithful. And maybe in the end, that mattered more. The hull gave one last tired groan. Water filled the stern. Slowly, almost gently, the old tug settled lower against the flood. Caleb came to stand beside her. "She saved them," he said. Evelyn swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah," she whispered. "She did." 3 days later, the water began to fall. The cleanup took weeks. Mud was shoveled. Walls were torn out. Photographs were dried in the sun. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years shared generators, casseroles, nails, bleach, and long quiet hours of work. And somewhere in the middle of all that wreckage, something else rose too: respect. Not the shallow kind that comes from gossip changing direction. The real kind. The kind built when people remember exactly who showed up when everything was falling apart. At the next town meeting, nobody laughed when Evelyn Hart walked in. Sheriff Reed stood first, then Mrs. Holloway, then Caleb. One by one, the whole room followed. No speech could fully cover what had happened. No apology could return the years she had spent being dismissed. But the standing silence said something words could not. "We were wrong. We see you now." Later that spring, they pulled the remains of the Mercy from the mud and set part of her hull near the landing as a memorial. Not to a boat, not really, but to a lesson. That strength does not always arrive polished. That wisdom is not always spoken by the loudest voice in the room. And that the people others overlook are sometimes the very ones who carry everyone else to safety. Evelyn still worked by the river after that. Only now she did not work alone. Maddie came by most afternoons to learn engines and rope lines. Caleb brought lumber and stayed longer than he needed to. Mrs. Holloway still barked orders like a general, but she always brought extra coffee. And when storm season came again, Blackstone did something it had never done before. It prepared. So let me ask you, have you ever seen someone get laughed at for doing the right thing, only to become the very person everyone needed in the end? If this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments. And if you believe quiet courage still matters in this world, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories that remind us what ordinary people are truly capable of.